Hi, everybody. This is Peter Schiff. It is Monday, July 30th, 2012. On Friday, the U.S. government gave us our first look at the second quarter GDP numbers. And according to the government, the economy grew at an annualized pace of just 1.5% in the second quarter. But it's actually far worse than that. You see, the GDP is supposed to reflect actual growth, not inflation. And so in order to do that, the government takes the nominal number and then they deflate it using an inflationary assumption to try to give us a real picture of what's happening to the U.S. economy when you strip out the effect of just rising prices or inflation. Now, in order to do that, the government assumed that the inflation during the second quarter of 2012 was an annual rate of 0.7%. So the government is claiming that inflation was less than 1% annualized during that particular quarter. Now, the deflator that they used to adjust the number averaged the first quarter with the second quarter. The first quarter, the government assumed inflation was 2.2% annualized. I still think that number was low, but I think it's a lot better than 0.7. But when you average them together, you get 1.6, and that is what the government used to deflate a 3.1% nominal rate for the second quarter down to 1.5. But the point I'm driving at is, what if the government is wrong? What if their methodology for capturing or measuring inflation is wrong? What if inflation is actually higher than the numbers suggest? Well, if inflation is actually at a 3.1% annualized rate so far for 2012 instead of 1.6, well, then the U.S. economy didn't grow at all in the second quarter. It was zero. And if inflation is any higher than 3.1%, then the economy contracted. And that's what I think is happening. Look at what's going on with corporate earnings. They're disappointing. Unemployment rate is still north of 8%. In fact, the real unemployment rate is north of 15% when you accurately account for the disgruntled workers, those working part-time that want to be working full-time. And those bad numbers, to me, jive with an economy in contraction. And so I think that is really the secret behind why the numbers aren't improving, despite the fact that the economy is supposedly growing, albeit at a slower pace than many would like. I think the truth is the economy is not growing. It's contracting. And in fact, I think we've been in a depression the entire time. That doesn't mean that every quarter has had negative GDP, but we are in an extended period of time where we're going to have a lot of negative GDP quarters. And I think the reason you can't see it is because the inflation numbers are too low. And if the government accurately reported them, then we would realize just how bad the economy is. I think a lot of Americans realize that on their own, and you have the experts just thinking, well, why aren't things getting better? Look, we've got growth. We don't have growth. What we have is inflation, and it's masquerading the fact or disguising the fact that we're actually in a recession. And unfortunately, the recession is going to get worse because the government, through its stimulus and through its bailouts and all the things that it's doing to numb the pain, they're actually making it worse because they prevent market forces from actually restructuring our economy in a way that would produce lasting economic growth. So instead we get inflation masquerading as economic growth, but in the meantime, the real economy continues to deteriorate, and so do employment opportunities. Also weighing on the U.S. economy will be the negative effect of this year's drought, which is one for the record books that is sending, or helping to send rather, grain prices through the roof, and ultimately other commodity prices, meat products where the animals are fed corn and the feed prices are going up. So it's going to ripple throughout the economy. But more than getting stuck with a higher food bill, Americans are going to have to pay massive bailouts to farmers thanks to federally subsidized crop insurance. In fact, many farmers are going to make more money during the drought, even if it means that they have to plow their fields under and they sell no corn at all. Many of them are going to make more money than they would have had there not been a drought and had they been able to harvest their crop and sell. The reason is the drought is helping to send prices soaring. Now, the policies, instead of paying off at a normal market, they basically reimburse the farmer for what they would have received had they been able to harvest and sell into today's market, even though today's market has a price that is artificially high because so many farmers will not be harvesting their crops, but will instead be cashing in their insurance policies. Now, these policies are much too lucrative thanks to federal subsidies. Had there been a free market in crop insurance, then it would be priced higher, the benefits would not be as lavish, and the taxpayers would not be on the hook now for both the inflated cost of food and having to pay huge bailouts to farmers who, because of the drought, are not able to harvest their crop. Now, this opens up a bigger issue of why do we have any agricultural programs? Why don't we just abolish the Department of Agriculture, save the money, and allow the free market to operate in farming? After all, if we did that, we would have a more vibrant agricultural industry. We would have lower prices for consumers. That would all be a good thing. But the problem is that farmers in America have a very powerful political lobby, and they're able to get these benefits. Now, they try to justify it. Farmers try to claim that farming is just so risky and that farmers are at the mercy of the weather, and therefore the government has to come in and help out. Otherwise, the farmers would go out of business. This is all a bunch of nonsense. All businesses have risk, and a lot of the risks are beyond the control of the entrepreneur. I mean, nobody is forced to be a farmer. If you don't like the risks associated with farming, then don't farm. Find some other business. But farms are not the only businesses that are subject to the vagaries of the weather. What if you operate a ski resort? Well, what happens if there's no snow? You're not going to sell any lift tickets. You don't get a government bailout. You don't have subsidies for the taxpayers. And, weather is not the only risk. In fact, I would say that there are many other businesses that inherently are more risky than farming. After all, people got to eat. So even, regardless of the weather, at least you know that if you harvest your crop, whatever corn you harvest, you're going to sell it. People are going to eat. But other businesses, you can have a product and all of a sudden you can go out of style. Or a lot of products, it's dependent on discretionary income, and they're much more cyclical and much more at the mercy of the business cycle or what's going on in the economy. Yet a lot of these business owners, they're not looking for subsidies. Why should one entrepreneur decides to open a shoe store and another entrepreneur decides he wants to farm, why should the guy opening a shoe store not only have to be subjected to the risk that nobody buys his shoes, but why should he also have to subsidize the risk of the farmer in case he doesn't get good weather in a particular year? So the whole thing is nonsense. It's all about politics. And unfortunately, the lion's share of these subsidies don't even go to the family farmers that are the poster boys for these programs. They go to giant mega agricultural businesses that are making a ton of money, and they would still be in business without all the government help. They just would have to pay market rates for their insurance, and they wouldn't have subsidized prices. So we'd have a free market. The idea that capitalism can work in other industries, but that it can't work in farming, and that the only reason we have farmers is because we have government subsidies, is pure nonsense. And it's all self-serving on the part of the agriculture lobby. And unfortunately, not enough American politicians are willing to stand up for the voters and the American people because they're too busy kowtowing to that agri lobby. As a final thought, there's a report out today that shows that Government Motors, otherwise known as GM, has now doubled the percentage of its cars that it's selling to subprime borrowers, meaning it is allowing people to finance the purchase of an automobile with very little down who have very low FICO scores. In other words, subprime lending. GM is selling cars to people who probably can't afford them and in all likelihood will end up defaulting on their auto loans. Now, why is GM doing this? Well, they're doing it because in the short run, they get to book the earnings associated with these sales, even if in the long run, the sales are going to result in losses when their customers mail in their pink slips instead of their car payments. And now GM has to deal with the losses that they will incur as a result of the repossession and having to resell into a depressed market But GM doesn't care if its actions today ultimately result in losses in the future, because after all, they're too big to fail. We know that. If they lose a fortune, the taxpayers are going to have to bail them out. In the meantime, the unionized workforce can make money, the executives can get their bonuses, and in the end, when the economy turns south and GM posts huge losses once again, well, the U.S. taxpayer is once again on the hook. This is a repeat of the mortgage market. It's the same mistakes that were made, again, with government encouragement, where people who couldn't afford to repay their mortgages were nevertheless sold houses with little or no down payments. They had low FICO scores, no, ninja loans, no jobs, no assets, teaser rates. Well, General Motors is doing the same thing. So this whole thing is a sham. The whole idea that the GM bailout is a success story based on the fact that they have earnings now. Well, would they really have these earnings if they were more judicious with respect to who they loaned money to and who they sold cars to? I mean, how many people are buying cars simply because they can get cheap financing right now, and for some reason they're being approved? Who knows? I mean, a lot of times these people are bringing their car to GM and they have negative equity in their existing car, and they're able to use that and transfer the negative equity into their new car purchase, get a 5 or 6 year car loan at an artificially low interest rate, and yeah, maybe they can swing the payments for a while, maybe they can't. But again, who cares? Because ultimately they can mail in the pink slip and not the check. And this is the moral hazard, but it's because the government is involved. The government has propped up this company and is incentivizing them to pad the numbers in the short run to make President Obama look good. Meanwhile, who gets hold in the bag? And look at the price of GM stock. I mean, as an indication, it's almost been cut in half since the U.S. government spun off part of its shares to the public. Of course, the U.S. government still owns a big chunk of government motors, and I'm sure they're pulling the strings behind the curtain. But what's going to happen to the price in the future? Where would GM stock be right now if they weren't padding their earnings by selling cars to people who are probably not going to actually pay for them? This is vendor financing at its worst, thanks to the U.S. government. That's it for today. Don't forget, we got a jobs number. The non-farm payrolls number from July is coming out on Friday. I'll try to blog on that maybe early next week. Meantime, tune into my shows on SchiffRadio.com. I talk in more detail and in more depth about all these issues every day for 2 hours, 10 a.m. to noon Eastern at SchiffRadio.com. Bye for now.